Well, making China the new bogeyman save NATO? On July the 10th, the 32-member military alliance issued a declaration at a summit in Washington mentioning China a record 14 times. It labeled China as a decisive enabler of the largest war in recent history in Europe. It also said China continues to pose systemic challenges to Euro-Atlantic security. China has deplored and strongly opposed the declaration for hyping up tensions in the Asia-Pacific region and being full of bellicose remarks with a Cold War mentality. Well, if I remember correctly, less than 5 years ago, NATO was considered brain-dead and obsolete. Since then, European allies and Canada have been pumping blood into its veins as defense expenditures have grown by 18% by 2024, the biggest increase in decades. Will such efforts resuscitate NATO? Will China give new meaning to its raison d'être? Will the world be safer as a result? I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, from Moscow by Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor of History at the American University, and here in the studio by Professor Jiang Gong, Vice President of UIB Israel. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, Mr. Zhou, let me go to you first. As I said, the declaration mentions China 14 times, stating that China challenges NATO's interests, security, and values. What has caused this latest bout of panic attack? Is it here to stay, and is it going to heat up?
Well, I think this has demonstrated NATO's increasing anxiety over China. Yes, everybody knows that US-led NATO actually bombarded China's embassy in Yugoslavia. So there was a period when this bilateral relationship was quite chilly. But ever since 2009, when the Chinese task force met NATO task force in Gulf of Aden, we actually started having the bilateral exchanges. This was followed by regular exchange of visits. Actually, China was kind enough to even invite Deputy Secretary General of NATO to attend the China's Shanghai Forum, for example. So this kind of description.
That was in 2009, or?
Yeah. So this kind of description by NATO about China being a decisive enabler is unprecedented. I think this has a lot to do with America's decision to take China as a top strategic competitor, because China actually has done nothing wrong about NATO. Yes, sometimes China sends ships to Mediterranean on the way to join, Russian navies for a joint exercise in the Baltic Sea, but that was conducted in the international water. We have done nothing wrong against NATO. So this is the other way around.
Anton, let me go to you. What do you think of NATO's accusations of China, saying China has ambitions and that China is, being a decisive enabler, prolonging the all-out aggression of Ukraine? Are these accusations founded on facts?
The accusations come from the very simple fact that Ukraine and NATO are losing the proxy war against Russia, and they're looking for scapegoat. And right. China fits the bill because NATO has made it public with great fanfare that they are planning on moving the operation, or part of their operation, into the Pacific to contain, deter China. And so this is the perfect excuse to start mobilizing Western European public opinion to sacrifice even more economically in order to sever the relationship between Europe and China by painting the Chinese as the bad guys in the war in Ukraine. And so I'm afraid that we're going through another inflection point as a civilization in the West, where Europe seems to be willingly turning itself into a military satellite of the United States. We've already seen the first blow to the economies of Europe when the Europeans severed their economic relations, especially in terms of energy supplies from the Russians, and this has had a devastating effect on European economies, and now they seem to be willing to take the next step, which is to do the same with China. So Europe may end up becoming an impoverished military forward base for the United
It's,
States
it's,
unless the European people come
yeah.
to their senses and elect new leaders.
Anton, let me pick two different concepts in your answer just now, because you mentioned Europe and there is NATO. Actually, they are different. NATO seems to be speaking on behalf of Europe or in close, alliance with the European Union. But actually, China is saying NATO is trying to disrupt China's relationship with Europe. What exactly is going on? Is NATO representing Europe's fundamental interests?
That is an excellent question, Yu, and we have seen how this relationship between the EU/Europe and NATO has become increasingly indistinguishable over the past 30 years, and especially over the past 10 years. It is impossible at this point to say where the EU or Europe or NATO end or begin, because they're simply growing together. But given that what's been going on in Ukraine, I think what we're seeing over the past 10 years, and especially the last 2 years, is the complete synergy, the complete growing together of Europe and NATO. And unfortunately, this is taking place at the devastating cost of the European economies, as the World Bank and IMF figures prove beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because as I mentioned, there's been an 18% increase in expenditure against the backdrop by NATO members. And this is against the backdrop of global economic slump, and Europe's economy is not looking very bleak. John, is this really going to inject new life into NATO? Is this sucking up too much valuable resources when European economies are suffering?
Well, I think this is coming from two things. One is that I think many European countries are genuinely, interested in supporting Ukraine. So they're shipping a lot of things into Ukraine from their current armaments, and they have to replenish these things. So expenditures have to increase for defenses. The second reason, I think, as our previous Russian guest has said, is that the issue regarding China being labeled as decisive enabler has a lot to do with the NATO side or the alliance side trying to find a scapegoat. Clearly, the Russians are advancing in the battlefield, and they have to find something to blame. And when the war first broke out, this kind of a normal trade relationship with Russia is not an issue at all. As a matter of fact, Washington drew a red line saying, you can't provide lethal assistance. The things they're talking about are not lethal assistance at all. As a matter of fact, the kind of things that China sells to Russia are also being sold to Ukraine as well. A lot of people don't want to talk about this in Europe, that China is also Ukraine's largest trading partner. We are shipping a lot of things to Ukraine. We're also buying a lot of things from Ukraine. As a matter of fact, if this notion of decisive neighbor in terms of things going to the defense industry in Russia can be characterized as a decisive enabler. Look at the kind of drones, civilian drones actually bought by Ukraine Ministry of Defense openly. They're putting this on their website saying we're buying this many DJI is a Chinese company, DJI drones from China, and adapting them for the battleground use. So this is totally unfair.
Let's look a bit further into that, Mr. Zhou, because this has been on the lips of European and NATO leaders for some time, that China is, indirectly supplying components to, and this dual use components. But data actually shows that over 60% of Russia's imported military components and dual use items come from Western countries, and 95% of Russia's key components destroyed by Ukraine also sourced from the West. So who are really enabling this war?
Actually, what you are saying, or just a quote from our spokesman, that actually caught me by surprise to know that actually in Russian weapons there are so many components actually come directly from the Western countries. And when they accuse China of selling Russia dual-use technology, dual-use products, I think it is essential for us to understand that when something is of dual-use in nature, you have to assume it is for civilian use first, because For example, normally we would not consider gas or diesel or petrol military products. But if they are put into the truck of a military, if they are put into a military truck, they could be used militarily. But normally people would not consider petrol or gas to be military products. So I think this kind of description actually reflect a kind of a deeper frustration that was a result of the failure of the kind of offensive from Ukrainian side ever since June last year. Actually, I personally believe this kind of prospect of Ukraine taking back fully the four provinces that are already declared to be Russian territory would not be very much realistic.
So Mr. Zhou, in a recent article you said making China the bogeyman is not going to make NATO's future brighter. Exactly why do you say that NATO is going downhill?
Yeah, this is almost like a Syria issue. If Western democracy has been in decline for 18 years, look at the shooting at Trump, this kind of democracy will certainly continue to decline. So a fundamental question is, if Western democracy itself is in decline, how can NATO become ever stronger? On the face of it, yes, there are two more countries joining NATO, but I believe NATO will just become more and more irrelevant because we definitely will see a splintering of this transatlantic alliance. Why? Because the United States, not being so strong as the past, would have to become more focused on China. So in this regard, Europe has to become a strategically independent itself. So this kind of separation has already started to emerge, although it takes some time. NATO won't die in a moment, but NATO will simply become more and more irrelevant in the future.
Anton, what is your take? Do you think that NATO is bluffing? Because it sounds that from the declaration they're quite popular. They have, just recently expanded to include Sweden, and it gives the impression that it wants Ukraine in as well, or Ukraine wants to join. Do you think NATO is bluffing?
No, I don't think NATO is bluffing at all. I think there's a military-industrial complex which is very interested in exactly what the communique articulated in Washington, and it's very powerful both in the United States and in certain countries, especially the most powerful countries in Europe. Unfortunately for the European and American populations, this means that the West will go into the rest of the 21st century as a military-industrial complex-dominated economy as opposed to a civilian economy. Everything will be tied into Rheinmetall in Germany and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and others in the United States, and this seems to be the way that the world is going. So I don't think NATO is bluffing, but whether it can actually hold together is a big question, because we're already seeing major splits despite all the attempts to paper them over in Washington. And I think that this disarray within the ranks of NATO will, unfortunately for the organization, get even worse.
Okay, we have to leave it there.
Ukrainians do on the battlefield.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much. We're running out of time. Many thanks to Zhou Bo, Anton Fadiation, and John Gong.